Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Dan Herman on post-Doha trade governance. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my privilege and pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some important topic on the global agenda. And today I'm pleased to welcome Dan Herman, a doctoral candidate here at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and an expert in trade governance. And you've recently come out with a new policy brief issued by CIGI, also by the title Post-Doha Trade Governance, in which you reflect upon the dangers of the global trade regime as we know it, basically spinning apart. I guess that would be the easiest way to characterize it.
That might be it. And you know, with the most prominent piece of the global trade agenda and the global trade governance being the World Trade Organization and the perhaps demise or death of the Doha Development Round being at the top of the agenda and the top of the newspaper headlines, it makes for a fascinating time to study trade governance as you look at the evolution of the WTO since the Uruguay round and how the Doha round has not progressed as it was once sought to, and how that has been accompanied by a real shift towards bilateral and regional agreements. And so this kind of confluence of two diverging directions in trade governance leaves a very big question as to what is the future of the WTO post-Doha, and or how does the WTO interact and coalesce with this now evolving world of regional and bilateral deals.
Mm-hmm. So for those who don't study trade policy in detail, let's go a little bit deep history here. So the WTO grew out of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, post-war, World War II. What was the vision at the time when people started talking about trade governance? What kind of structure or regime did they have in mind? What did they want to build to?
Well, and this is a complicated area. It's a very complex area of negotiations, not only to form the World Trade Organization in '95, but earlier as the formation of the GATT, which had, in the pre-World War II period, you had, the 30s, which were marked by trade disputes, by really a breakdown of pre-1930s trade governance, and you had, from the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which puts large tariff walls on imports into the U.S., and then you had essentially a lost decade of trade governance where you had what many call beggar thy neighbor trade policies. And so in the 40s, through the Bretton Woods moment, you had a series of efforts to build a multilateral trade governance organization. On one hand, there were negotiations towards what would have been called the International Trade Organization. Those talks broke down because ultimately the pursuit of a multilateral, all-encompassing agenda faced off against domestic interests. And so for a period of about 20 years or so, you had kind of spits and starts in trade governance through various frameworks and agreements with no fundamental organization underpinning it. And through the GATT, which is an agreement, it's not an organization, so it provided the framework and the structure for trade deals, and expanding from 30 members at its start from the start of negotiations post World War II, and expanding into the hundreds by the 90s. And now you see the WTO essentially covering most, if not all, major trading partners, and with those who are not in it, still very much trying to gain either access or onto the accession ladder. And the same problems exist today at the WTO, where the desire for an all-encompassing trade deal that provides for trade liberalization across both manufactured and service goods, while in a sense perfect in a theoretical world, that faces off against domestic constraints. And so through GATT, through the Uruguay round, which was the first of the WTO rounds, and now at Doha, this negotiation between the domestic and the international is at a continuous interplay.
What was the impetus to move to a WTO? And GATT, I thought, was most people thought it was working pretty well, but there was some reason people had to create an organization.
Well, a primary part of it was to create an administrative system. And, you know, bureaucracy gets a bad name, but the WTO at the heart of it is a bureaucratic system and dispute settlement mechanism that it provides a very powerful and essentially leveling playing field for some of the weaker parties. So, you know, the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO and the arbitration panels that are present allow weaker, smaller developing countries to bring disputes forward or to defend themselves in disputes against larger parties. And that bureaucracy that's formed around it thus allows everyone at the table essentially an equal voice and a more democratic means of coming to consensus where possible on both trade issues and related non-trade issues. And the WTO, that's really the foundational element of it, is the dispute settlement mechanism that, you know, while most of us think of the WTO in terms of the negotiations around the Uruguay round and now the 12 years of stop and starts around Doha, ultimately perhaps its most powerful feature and most useful feature is the dispute settlement process that allows
what's held up Doha exactly? I mean, 12 years is a long time.
12 years is a long time, and you know, it's even, you know, the death of Doha was predicted by many before it started. In 2008, there was essentially a full stop on negotiations. They were restarted. In 2011 was really when the primary negotiators at the table, so the large countries, decided that perhaps it was time to take a breather. And then since 2011, you've had a series of potential starts of comments on the worthiness of the deal. The Doha Development Round is named for its development purpose. It was initially framed as a means of helping developing countries surmount those last barriers, both to their own industrialization, to their access to emerging or to developed markets, as well as the barriers that exist between them. And the key the key issue that still impedes, or has impeded and perhaps has nailed the coffin shut on Doha are two issues. One is, and these are by no means all encompassing, but they're the two most evident issues, is the developed countries' desires for increased access to developing markets. And then you've got the developing countries who want an end or a reform of subsidies around both industrial and agricultural subsidies in developed markets. So, and again, it's this interplay between wanting to protect the domestic, allowing it to nurture in both developed and developing, that comes up into conflict with the competitive nature of a global economy.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Dan Herman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, no progress at Doha on a global adjustment to the trade regime. What have countries been doing in the meantime? Not sitting still.
Exactly, and that's the fascinating part of trade governance outside of the WTO, is that over the last 12 years you've had this proliferation of bilateral, regional, plurilateral deals that have emerged in either the wake of the failure of Doha or really almost as hedging bets against the failure of Doha. And these are both by large parties, by small parties. The European Union definitely at the forefront of this movement or this divergence of interest from the WTO. They've signed agreements with 80 different countries in their sphere. That provide, in some cases, WTO plus. So these are agreements that go beyond what members of the WTO have agreed to, whether this is for tariffs, whether it's for non-tariff barriers, for intellectual property agreements or stipulations. The United States has agreed to 20 such agreements, Canada less than 10, but dozens in negotiation. And so across the major players, you have very much a focus on, if the WTO isn't working and if we can't guarantee ourselves increased market access, a reduction in tariffs, more stringent intellectual property or cultural protection rules, then the bilateral regional route has been, or has now evolved as the most, the easiest route in order to get there.
And this is because it's easy to sort of protect your national champions and so forth. And if you're specifying which countries you're doing deals with and ignoring those, it would be harder to do.
Well, and there's two ways to look at that. One is more altruistic than the other. And on one hand, you have what some will call the coalition of like-minded parties,
right,
that you'll form these agreements with countries or trading partners that have like interests, that have like perspectives on what IP infringement should mean, or what IP protection should mean, with like industries. So wherever there's complementaries. The other side of that would be that power tends to play itself out a bit more forcefully in these bilateral regional deals, where for example, you know, if and I'll avoid the use of any specific parties, but if a large trading partner wishes to seek increased market access to a developing economy, the power tends to play out in favor of the larger. And whereas the WTO, again, to the bureaucratic nature of it, well, also the democratic nature of it, is it's a one-member, one-vote consensus-making organization. So at the WTO, you can be Paraguay and you can still veto a deal. In a bilateral agreement, if the leverage does not exist for one trading partner, and if the needs dictate that your economy requires or would benefit more greatly from access to a larger trading partner, that smaller trading partner has much less ability to forestall any negotiating tactic or anything it would like to protect.
Now, are some countries being left out of these bilateral and plurilateral deals?
Yeah, and the fascinating part is who is being left out. China, for example, is kind of the remaining dance partner on the floor, that as the European Union has sought to increase its environment of FTAs, of free trade agreements, as the United States has sought to do so throughout the Americas primarily, but also now crossing the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. You have an evolving bloc, in a sense, that doesn't include China. And so, you know, Chinese scholarship has increasingly looked at what is going on and what does it mean for China. And so you increasingly see comments about the need for China to protect itself in some form against these evolving trade blocs that don't include it. And so, you know, you have now an announcement from China or from East Asia that China, Japan, and South Korea will begin negotiations as to the possibility of forming a regional agreement, one that makes a lot of sense, a lot of complementarities through supply chain and logistics, and one that would also form an economy or a regional bloc of quite sufficient size to then position itself with more leverage versus a European trading bloc, a North American, or now, as we talk about, a transatlantic trade bloc.
And what would be the preferred currency for the Chinese, Japanese, Korean bloc?
Well, I haven't seen specific mention of that, but one could infer from various moves over the past that the renminbi might be high on the list. Yeah.
So the fracturing of the world trade regime, I assume, is something that on balance is more attractive to more countries, given the state of paralysis at Doha.
It could be. One could see that
countries aren't scrambling to re-energize Doha in the wake
well, there's actually, they haven't. You know, you think since 2001, Doha has essentially floundered. So one could think that, very perhaps realistically, that most are willing to let it die. The question that then is raised is, as you have this proliferation of preferential trade deals that will then have different stipulations around rules of origin, around which products from which countries get this tariff rate, it creates transaction costs as goods start to flow around the economy, the global economy. As those transaction costs mount, especially for smaller players at the table, it does create an incentive to look once again at the multilateral agenda as a potential leveling force and a potential liberalizing force to avoid those costs. Now, the question is, are these regional agreements and bilateral agreements a means of slowly constructing something bigger, or are they an impediment to something bigger? And that's what we've yet to see.
Fascinating. Be back again in a moment with Dan Herman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So where's Canada in this? What's the Canadian attitude towards Doha on the one hand, non-Doha agreements on the other hand?
Well, so as always, there's two routes, right? It's never a simple path. And so on one hand, Canada has been increasingly pursuing a bilateral and regional strategy. The largest of Canada's strategies is focused on the comprehensive economic framework with the European Union. This is a deal that's been in negotiation since May 2009. We're at the final steps now of a potential conclusion of this deal. There are still very large hurdles as it regards agricultural, chemical, intellectual property issues that may or may not lead to its conclusion. Canada, in a sense, has a much larger stake in these negotiations than does the European Union. For the EU, Canada represents about 1.5% of total trade. For Canada, the EU represents about 11%. So in terms of leverage, Canada isn't necessarily at the holding all the cards here.
So it's certainly true that Europe is more important to Canada than vice versa, but if I remember my history of the Canada-US free trade negotiations back in the late 80s correctly, that turned into an advantage for Canada because we had so much more at stake, that we had a much bigger team, they had better information, they were better organized in the negotiation, and actually when the deal was done, a lot of people at the end of the day looked at it and said, wow, the Canadians really won that one.
Well, and there's a large body of literature around both the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement and then what progressed to become the North American Free Trade Agreement after when Mexico came on the scene. And the evolution of that deal is perhaps instructive, as you saw a Canada-U.S. agreement then be matched by a U.S.-Mexico agreement, and then finally the creation of this all-encompassing regional agreement that is NAFTA. And now as we think of Canada and Europe, and then we think of Europe and the United States, which earlier this year President Obama announced his full support for the onset of negotiations with the European Union. You have full support across the European Commission. Ireland, who holds the presidency of the European Commission this year, has made not only the onset of negotiations, but to a degree the fulfillment of negotiations, the hallmark of its presidential year. And so now again you get this chemistry at the table where you have agreements in a region being negotiated in tandem. And now the question is, when the other party for Canada is not a smaller economy that was Mexico, but rather is a larger economy that is the United States, will the gains be similar? Canada and the United States have a lot of complementary industry. There's also a lot of competing industry. And so there's certainly an aspect of first mover advantage that if the Americans were to get signature on an agreement, and this is still, negotiations have not started and they will likely take at a minimum 2 years and more likely 3 or 4. But should Canadian negotiations stall and the Americans be able to essentially jump into the lead, that could have some relatively dramatic repercussions for Canadian manufacturers, for Canadian industrial players seeking access to European market or increased access. The question then becomes, is this parallel track of Canada-Europe and EU United States trade negotiations, does that lead to something bigger? And as NAFTA was the evolution of three-party talks, does TAFTA become something bigger? Does a transatlantic free trade agreement that includes Canada, the U.S., and the European Union evolve out of this over the course of the next couple of years?
Would that automatically include Mexico because of NAFTA?
It should because of Mexico. By definition it will. And it should because Mexico is, in a sense, the forgotten North American trading partner. Yet, it's the largest non-American economy in North America. It has surpassed Brazil in terms of growth. It will in terms terms of size of the economy. And now over the last year, we see a real growth in Mexican manufacturing, which had suffered over the past 2 decades in terms of competition with Chinese manufacture, but now we see a return of manufacturing to Mexico and thus huge impacts on the southern U.S. economy and into Canada.
Very good. We'll be back one last time with Dan Herman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So there are always unintended consequences to everything in life, and I'm wondering if the world is a better place or a worse place from the unintended consequences perspective when you've got this sort of proliferation of particular trade agreements. What does that do for politicians who want to make policy to benefit their constituencies, protect their economies? Does it give them more avenues through which to do that, or does it tie their hands in an increasingly complicated, unforeseeable set of ways?
Well, and policymakers will always want to benefit their local constituents, and this is this interplay of the international and the domestic. And so the bilateral world is, Jagdish Bhagwati called it in the mid-90s, he said it creates the spaghetti bowl of strings, and so as you pick the fork up, you get a mesh of strings, and for a policymaker, that's all those strings on that fork are now a complicating mess in order to form local policy that has to in some way cohere with the international. So a good example of this is the Ontario government, which in 2009 created a program which was ostensibly to promote the wind energy development. And in the text of the bill that was passed in Ontario was a promotional clause for local industry, so a local content requirement. That evidently done to satisfy local interests around employment, especially in southern Ontario, hard hit by the closure of manufacturing facilities. But then the question becomes, how does this in any way either infringe or how is it congruent with international law? And so, very quickly after passing this bill, the Japanese government and the European Union both brought disputes to the WTO, to the dispute settlement mechanism, and the appellate board, seeking to appeal this local policy on the grounds that it was uncompetitive and discriminatory. And earlier late in 2012, the WTO ruled against Ontario in this case. So here you have a real good example of how the local and the international play together in a sense, and sometimes they don't play nicely. And for a local policymaker in this case, seeking not only to change the mix of energy consumption and production in a jurisdiction, but also really to focus on local job creation. Well, all of a sudden that needs to play well with the international legal framework and the international trade framework. In this case, while it is being appealed by both the province of Ontario through the Canadian government, the writing, in a sense, is on the wall that it will not pass muster in terms of the WTO's ruling on subsidies.
And if I remember this case rightly, and I may not, that bill also wound up including a provision for Samsung in Korea, right, to basically have monopoly rights on some aspect of the wind energy.
Yeah, it's whether it's monopoly or whether they have essentially an advantage based on the size of their investment and their willingness to come to the table to negotiate with the Ontario government.
Right. So how did Korea react to this when you've got Japan and Europe and so on challenging an Ontario bill?
And this is what's fascinating, is that you have this interplay that what we consider local, right, is no longer local. And that all of a sudden, Korea and a lot of the East Asian economies, which, matured, with policies that were not necessarily congruent with what was accepted at the international level through, at the time, the GATT. Real vibrant industrial policies were at the heart of the East Asian economic transformation. And so now you have these companies that have grown up, such as Samsung, through those processes that now essentially are facing the other side of that, of how that impacts them both in their home markets and abroad as they seek advantages. But at the one of the fascinating parts of this is that you have now trade issues being not necessarily usurped, but being impacted by subnational jurisdictions. So you have provinces that are not constitutionally at the table with the federal government or U.S. states, but because of the size of their economies, the devolution of powers around economic development, now have an ability to impact those agreements and to play favorites, whether it's with specific industries as we think of moving up the value chain or trying to seek the next wave of creative destruction, or whether it's in picking winners and trying to promote industrial development or the development of any industry through deals with specific companies. And so the interplay is now not just between nations, but also amongst the subnational elements in those nations, and how they both engage with and perhaps engage without the higher level of government.
So it sounds to me like this is a recipe for a lot of trade lawyers to get rich relatively quickly, but for a lot of things that might be desirable from a public policy perspective to get stalled and hung up.
I've probably chosen the wrong field, focusing on the policy aspects and not the legal aspects.
So.
It would have been more advantageous. But it is. The globalization, in a sense, has the ability to promote huge development initiatives. And if you look at the past 30 years, the number of people who've been brought out of poverty, in some large way attributable to international trade, global supply chains. But as the world competes now, you have more people competing, and so for richer jurisdictions, that means more competition in the fields that they thought they were the leaders of, and that competition and the employment and unemployment that are essentially the necessary factors that are created outside of it, now become very vibrant policy discussion areas of how important is it to stick with the agreements and with the frameworks that are negotiated at the local level if they hold perhaps unanticipated and potentially negative consequences at the local level. And in the post global financial crisis and the aftermath of the recession, you see a very significant uptick in the number of discriminatory measures led by both large and small economies, developed and developing, but 2/3 by some estimates by G20 members, trade actions, whether it's through tariff or non-tariff barriers, enacted to give themselves some leg up in the market. And I think that's very indicative, not of a wholesale shift to a 1930s style of the Great Depression era of trade protectionism, but a much more stealth form of trade protectionism that is ultimately all about local jobs and local people.
And do you think the train has left the station, that we're stuck with this fractured world, or is there a window? Do you see a window to try to re-energize?
I do see a window, and I think perhaps the fear of the transatlantic free trade agreement, the fact that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is being negotiated, I think this is going to raise questions in a lot of the peripheral members in the trading community as to what does that mean in terms of those costs of those transaction costs. What does it mean in terms of power? And that creates a window to all of a sudden go back to the WTO as the locus of trade governance. The Chinese ambassador to the WTO this morning stating that the WTO needs to be re-energized. And I think we'll see more of that as these bilateral and regional agreements get bigger in scope and include bigger trading partners, include a greater share of the total global economy. As that progresses, so too will that window of opportunity to look at the WTO one more time as a means of creating a multilateral framework that levels the playing field and ensures space for politicians to ensure local employment, but also ensures that there's a relatively level playing field for both rich and poor.
A new grand bargain.
Exactly.
Well, thanks again for coming in and helping us
Thank you.
understand these very complicated issues better. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. This actually concludes our third season of Inside the Issues, the CIGI online podcast. We will be back again in September with season 4, and we hope that you will join us then. Until then, this is David Welch wishing you all the best, and please join us again when we're available on Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.